Some questions don't need answers to leave a mark. They just need to stay unanswered long enough. There's a specific kind of confusion that settles in when someone's behavior shifts and they never explain why. Not the confusion that comes from a fight or a betrayal. Those at least give you something to react to. This is different. This is the slow realization that the person you're with has changed their relationship to you, and you're the last one to know. You feel it before you can name it. In the delays, in the tone, in the absence of things that used to be automatic. And because there's no clear event to point to, you start questioning your own perception. Maybe you're imagining it. Maybe you're overreacting. Maybe this is just what relationships look like when they mature. But maturity doesn't feel like distance. And what you're feeling now, this quiet, persistent sense that something fundamental has shifted, isn't paranoia. It's pattern recognition. Your nervous system is picking up on behavioral patterns that your mind hasn't fully processed yet. Small changes in emotional behavior. Subtle erosion of attachment patterns. A slow withdrawal that never announces itself but makes its presence known through absence. This is where relationship psychology becomes less about what's said and more about what's done. Or more accurately, what's no longer done. Because when someone begins to disengage, they don't usually tell you. They just start showing up differently. The psychological dynamics shift from active connection to passive participation. They're still there, technically. But the quality of their presence has changed. The emotional distance grows not through conflict, but through a series of micro-withdrawals that accumulate over time. A text that takes longer to return. A plan that gets forgotten. A conversation that doesn't go as deep as it used to. Individually, these moments mean nothing. But together they form a language. A language that speaks not through words, but through behavior. And if you've been watching closely, if you've been tracking the patterns rather than just reacting to isolated events, you already know what that language is saying. You just haven't been ready to hear it yet. What follows isn't advice. It's not a strategy for winning someone back or fixing what's broken. It's an analysis. A careful, unflinching look at the behavior analysis that reveals how emotional withdrawal actually operates, how it begins, how it progresses, how it hides in plain sight while quietly dismantling the connection you thought was secure. This is about understanding relationship patterns not as you wish they were, but as they actually function. Because clarity, uncomfortable as it is the only thing that gives you back your agency. And agency is what you lose when you're trapped in ambiguity, waiting for answers that never come, interpreting silence through hope instead of evidence, and adjusting to distance as if it's something you chose. It's not. But by the time you realize that, the distance has already done its work. And the questions that were never answered have already left their mark. There's a moment when something shifts. Not loudly. Not with an argument or a confession. Just a slight change in how words land. The tone doesn't match what's being said. It's softer or flatter or just off. You notice it, but you don't yet know what you're noticing. This is where relationship psychology begins to surface, not in what's spoken, but in how it's delivered. The emotional behavior underneath the language starts to separate from the surface. You replay the conversation later, trying to find what felt wrong, but there's nothing concrete to hold, just a feeling that the rhythm changed. And because there's no clear cause, you don't react. You adjust. You tell yourself it's nothing, But the adjustment itself is the first sign that something inside the dynamic has already moved. The shift doesn't announce itself. It just quietly repositions the emotional distance between two people. What happens next isn't dramatic. It's not withdrawal that screams for attention. It's more like the air pressure drops slightly, and you feel it without knowing why. You begin scanning for reasons that don't exist yet. You try to connect the shift to stress, to work, to fatigue, anything external. And maybe those things are real, but they don't explain the tone, because tone isn't shaped by circumstance alone. It's shaped by how someone feels about the space they're in with you. When that feeling begins to change, the voice follows, not in volume, in texture. And once that texture shifts, it doesn't fully return. You might hear warmth again later, but it won't feel the same. The baseline has moved, and you, still unaware of what's shifting beneath the surface, start adapting to a reality that hasn't been named. The relationship patterns you relied on to read each other begin to feel unreliable. You're still inside the relationship, but the coordinates have changed. This is not about one conversation. It's about the cumulative weight of small alterations that don't resolve. Each shift is minor enough to dismiss, but together, they form a psychological dynamic that rewrites how presence feels. You start noticing not what was said, but what wasn't. The silences between responses grow longer. Not by much. Just enough. And in that small gap, something else moves in. Doubt. Not about them, about your own perception. Because if nothing exploded, if nothing was declared, then maybe nothing's wrong. That's the trap. Emotional withdrawal doesn't always look like absence. Sometimes it looks like a version of the person that's technically still there, but no longer leaning in. The attachment patterns you built together begin to lose their footing. What once felt automatic now requires effort, and effort, when it's not reciprocated, becomes the first quiet erosion of emotional balance. You don't see it as erosion yet, you see it as adjustment. But adjustment over time is how distance gets normalized. The question that begins forming, though you won't ask it yet, is simple. Did something happen, or did something stop happening? And that question, left unanswered, starts to reshape everything that comes next. The delays start small. A text that used to come back in minutes now takes an hour. Then 2. Then half a day. And each time, there's a reason. A meeting ran long. The phone was on silent. They got distracted. The explanations are reasonable, and you accept them because there's no evidence to suggest otherwise. But what you're not tracking yet is the pattern. Behavioral patterns don't reveal themselves in single moments. They build across time. One delayed response is circumstantial. 5 in a row is a shift in priority. The emotional behavior underneath isn't about being busy. It's about where attention naturally flows when someone isn't thinking about it. And when that flow starts moving away from you, the delays aren't really delays. They're redirections. You're still receiving responses, so it doesn't feel like withdrawal. It feels like adjustment to a new rhythm. But rhythm, in relationships, is everything. When one person slows down and the other doesn't, the entire psychological dynamic begins to tilt. What makes this phase difficult is that it still looks functional. Messages are answered. Plans are kept. There's no breach of explicit commitment, so you tell yourself it's fine. Maybe they're just stressed. Maybe this is temporary. and maybe it is. But the mind doesn't only track what's said, it tracks what's felt. And what you're starting to feel is a quiet uncertainty. Not panic, not anger. Just a low-level hum of something unresolved. The relationship psychology here is simple. When someone's emotional investment begins to shift, their response time reflects it before their words do. They're not lying. They're not hiding anything. They're just not prioritizing the same way. And that lack of priority, even when it's unconscious, creates emotional distance that you can't name yet. You notice it in your body first. The slight tension when you send a message. The quick glance at the phone that didn't used to be there. The small disappointment that arrives when the response finally comes. Because by then, the moment has already passed. This is where communication breakdown starts. Not with conflict, but with timing. When emotional reciprocity loses its pace, the space between people grows without anyone acknowledging it. You begin making internal adjustments to manage your own expectations. You tell yourself not to expect quick replies. You tell yourself it doesn't mean anything. And in doing so, you start training yourself to need less. That training is invisible, but it's active. It's a form of self-protection that you don't yet recognize as such. Because if you acknowledged what you were protecting yourself from, you'd have to name what's changing. And naming it would mean confronting it. So instead, you adapt. You lower the bar, you stop checking the phone as much, you stop sending the second text, and without realizing it, you've begun participating in the very distance you're trying to ignore. The attachment patterns that once felt secure now operate on a slight delay. Not broken, just slower. And the slowness itself becomes the new baseline. What used to feel like connection now feels like coordination. And coordination, when it replaces closeness, is the first sign that presence is being replaced by function. Inconsistencies begin to show up in small ways. A plan gets forgotten. A detail you mentioned isn't remembered. A promise to call doesn't happen. And when you bring it up, the response is casual. Almost surprised you even noticed. These moments are easy to dismiss individually. Everyone forgets things. Everyone gets distracted. But when the same type of inconsistency repeats, it stops being circumstantial. It becomes a pattern. And patterns, in relationship dynamics, are not accidents. They're expressions of where someone's attention actually is. When presence becomes inconsistent, it's not usually because someone is trying to hurt you. It's because their internal focus has shifted, and the behaviors that used to be automatic now require conscious effort. And when effort is required for things that used to be natural, the relationship has already changed, even if neither person has said so yet. What you start noticing isn't absence. It's the quality of presence when it does show up. They're there, but not fully. The conversation happens, but it feels lighter. Less rooted. You can sense that part of their attention is somewhere else, even when they're looking at you. This is where emotional detachment begins, not as a decision, but as a drift. The psychological dynamics shift from connection to maintenance. You're still together, but the energy that used to bind you is dispersing. And because there's no clear event to point to, you question whether you're overreacting. You wonder if you're being too sensitive. You replay moments in your mind, searching for proof that something's wrong, but the proof is always just out of reach. Because what you're looking for isn't in what they're doing. It's in what they're not doing. The absence of initiative. The absence of follow-through. The absence of the small, consistent gestures that used to say, "I'm thinking about you." Those absences don't create noise. They create silence. And silence, over time, becomes its own language. This is where behavior analysis becomes necessary, even if you don't realize you're doing it. You start tracking, not consciously at first, but your mind begins cataloging the gaps, the forgotten plans, the repeated delays, the conversations that don't go as deep as they used to. You're not looking for evidence of betrayal. You're looking for evidence of investment. And when that evidence becomes harder to find, you start filling in the gaps with explanations. You tell yourself they're stressed. You tell yourself it's a phase. You tell yourself it'll pass. But underneath those explanations, a different awareness is forming. The awareness that something has fundamentally shifted in how they show up. Not all at once, not with intention, just gradually, quietly, and without acknowledgement. And because it's gradual, you adjust to it. You normalize the inconsistency. You lower your expectations again. And in doing so, you begin accepting a version of the relationship that's less than what it was. The question forming now is no longer did something happen. It's how long has this been happening? And that question, once it surfaces, doesn't go away. It sits in the background of every interaction, waiting for more data, waiting for the pattern to either resolve or confirm itself. Confusion becomes the dominant emotional state. Not the kind that comes from a single event, but the kind that builds when nothing quite makes sense and nothing quite resolves. You find yourself replaying conversations, rereading messages, trying to locate the exact moment things changed. But the moment doesn't exist. There was no fight, no betrayal, no clear turning point. Just a series of small shifts that, when viewed individually, mean nothing, but when viewed together, mean everything. This is where the mind starts working against itself. You want clarity, but seeking clarity feels like overreacting. You want to ask what's wrong, but you're afraid the answer will be nothing, and that will make you feel foolish. So you stay quiet. You observe. You wait for more evidence. And while you wait, the internal confusion grows. Because the lack of explanation becomes its own form of emotional withdrawal. When someone's behavior changes and they don't address it, the silence around that change becomes louder than the change itself. This internal state is where relationship psychology becomes deeply uncomfortable. You're caught between two conflicting realities. The reality of what's happening, the delays, the distance, the inconsistency, and the reality of what's being said, which is often nothing's wrong. And when those two realities don't align, your perception becomes unreliable. You start doubting yourself. Maybe you're imagining it. Maybe you're too needy. Maybe this is normal, and you're just not handling it well. The psychological dynamics here are brutal, because they don't offer resolution. They offer ambiguity. And ambiguity, in emotional behavior, is corrosive. It doesn't allow you to act, but it doesn't let you rest either. You're stuck in a state of low-level vigilance, scanning for signs that either confirm or deny what you're starting to suspect. And the more you scan, the more exhausted you become. Not from what's happening, but from trying to figure out if anything's happening at all. What you don't realize yet is that confusion is not a neutral state. It's an active one. It's your mind trying to reconcile attachment patterns that no longer match the behavior you're witnessing. You were taught, through repetition, that this person shows up in certain ways, that they respond with certain rhythms, that their presence has a certain weight. And now, those patterns are breaking down. Not dramatically, just enough to create static, And that static doesn't resolve through thinking. It resolves through clarity, which means someone has to speak. But if they're not speaking, and you're not speaking, then the confusion just compounds. You begin interpreting their silence through your own fears. You begin filling in the gaps with narratives that may or may not be true. And in doing so, you create a version of the relationship that exists only in your mind. One where you're constantly trying to figure out what went wrong, while they may not even be aware that anything has. The emotional distance grows not because of what's said, but because of what isn't. And distance, when it's not acknowledged, becomes the new foundation. You stop expecting clarity. You stop expecting consistency. You start expecting less. And that expectation, quiet and unspoken, becomes the soil in which resentment begins to grow. Not loud resentment, not explosive. Just a low, steady awareness that something isn't right, and no one is naming it. And the longer it goes unnamed, the harder it becomes to bring up. Because by the time you have the words, the distance has already settled in. And confronting it feels less like seeking truth, and more like admitting you've been hurt by something no one meant to do. Which raises the question, if no one meant it, does it still count? And the answer, psychologically, is always yes. Intent doesn't erase impact. Silence doesn't erase distance. And confusion, left unresolved, becomes its own form of conclusion. You begin trying to interpret what's happening through past patterns. You remember how they used to act when they were stressed, how they withdrew before, but always came back, how they needed space sometimes, and you gave it, and things returned to normal. So you apply those memories to the present. You tell yourself this is just another phase, that they'll come back like they always have. But what you're not accounting for is that past patterns only work when the underlying dynamic hasn't changed. And when the dynamic has shifted, when emotional investment has quietly decreased, the old patterns stop predicting the future. What worked before doesn't work now. Not because you're doing anything wrong, but because the context has evolved. The relationship psychology you relied on to navigate closeness is now being applied to something that resembles closeness, but no longer functions like it. And that mismatch creates more confusion, not less. This is where people often stay stuck the longest. They keep referencing the past as proof that things will improve. They point to previous moments of reconnection as evidence that this distance is temporary. And maybe it is, but maybe it isn't. The issue is that you're using historical data to interpret present behavior, and the present behavior is telling a different story. One that doesn't align with reunion. One that suggests not a phase, but a shift. The behavioral patterns you're witnessing now, reduced initiation, slower responses, less depth in conversation, those aren't signs of temporary stress. They're signs of reduced priority. And priority, once it shifts, doesn't usually return just because time passes. It returns when something internally realigns. And if that internal shift hasn't happened, then waiting for the old version of them to come back is waiting for something that may no longer exist. This is the psychological trap of attachment patterns. They teach us to expect continuity, to believe that people are fundamentally consistent, and that love, once established, operates on a stable frequency. But emotional behavior doesn't work that way. It shifts based on internal states, unmet emotional needs, evolving desires, and 100 quiet recalibrations that happen beneath the surface of awareness. When someone begins to emotionally withdraw, they often don't know they're doing it. They just feel different, less drawn in, less engaged. And because they don't have language for it, they don't communicate it. They just start showing up differently. And you, interpreting their behavior through the lens of who they used to be, miss what's actually happening. You see the delay and think they're busy. You see the distance and think they need space. You see the silence and think they'll come back. But none of those interpretations address the reality forming between you, that the relationship dynamics have fundamentally changed, and neither of you has said it out loud yet. So you keep waiting. You keep adjusting. You keep interpreting. And while you do, the distance continues to grow. Not because you're not trying, but because trying, without acknowledgement from the other side, is just effort poured into a space that's no longer holding it. The patterns you trusted are breaking down. The behaviors you relied on are absent. And the person you thought you knew is becoming someone you have to guess at. Which means you're no longer in a relationship built on clarity. You're in one built on interpretation. And interpretation without confirmation is just hope disguised as understanding. The question you're avoiding now is simple. What if they're not coming back the way they used to? And that question, once it enters your mind, changes everything. Because it forces you to stop waiting and start seeing. The asymmetry becomes undeniable. You're the one texting first. You're the one suggesting plans. You're the one asking how they are, checking in, keeping the thread alive. And they respond, sometimes warmly, sometimes briefly, but they don't initiate. Not anymore. Not like they used to. The emotional initiative has shifted entirely to your side, and it's exhausting in a way you can't quite name. Because it's not that they're absent. It's that they're passive. They show up when you reach out. They engage when you create the space. But left to their own rhythm, they don't move toward you. And that passivity, quiet as it is, speaks louder than any words could. It tells you where you sit in their internal world. Not at the center, not even close. Somewhere on the periphery, where things are noticed when prompted, but not prioritized when left alone. This asymmetry is where relationship patterns begin to fracture. Because reciprocity isn't just about equal effort. It's about mutual desire to connect. When one person consistently carries the weight of connection, it's not a partnership anymore. It's a maintenance role. You become the person who keeps things going, not because they want it to go, but because you're afraid of what happens if you stop. And that fear is valid. Because deep down, you already know. If you stopped reaching out, the contact would slow. Maybe stop altogether. And that knowledge sits heavy in your chest, unspoken, but ever present. You don't test it, because testing it would force a conclusion you're not ready for. So instead, you keep going. You keep initiating. You keep carrying the emotional labor of keeping the relationship alive. And with each instance of unreciprocated effort, the psychological dynamics shift further out of balance. What you're experiencing now is not just distance, it's emotional inequality. One person leaning in while the other leans back. One person investing while the other conserves. And that inequality, over time, breeds resentment. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind. The kind that shows up as a sigh before you pick up the phone. The kind that makes you hesitate before sending a text, wondering if it'll even matter. The kind that slowly erodes your sense of worth within the relationship. Because if you have to work this hard to maintain someone's attention, what does that say about how they feel? The attachment patterns you built were supposed to be mutual. But now, they're one-sided. And one-sided attachment isn't attachment. It's dependency. You've become dependent on their occasional presence to validate the effort you're putting in. And they, whether they realize it or not, have become comfortable with your pursuit. They no longer have to try because you're doing it for both of you. This is where people often blame themselves. They wonder if they're too needy, if they're asking for too much, if they should be more independent, more secure, less affected by the imbalance. But the issue isn't neediness. It's that emotional reciprocity has collapsed. And when reciprocity collapses, no amount of self-sufficiency will make the relationship feel balanced again. You can't fix unequal investment by investing more. You can only exhaust yourself trying. The behavior analysis here is simple. When someone stops initiating, it's not because they're busy or distracted. It's because the internal drive to connect has diminished. And that diminishment doesn't reverse through patience. It reverses through realization, on their end. But if that realization never comes, then you're left holding the weight of something that only you still want to carry. And the question that grows louder now, even though you try to silence it, is this: what am I holding on to? And why am I the only one holding it? Regularities begin to form that you can no longer ignore. They're not present on certain nights. They don't respond during specific hours. They're unavailable in patterns that feel too consistent to be random. At first, you told yourself it was coincidence. Then you told yourself it was routine. But now, the regularity itself becomes evidence. Not of betrayal, necessarily, but of distance. Of a life that's being lived separately, with boundaries you're no longer inside. The behavioral patterns you're witnessing are no longer scattered. They're structured. And structure in emotional withdrawal is what separates distraction from decision. When someone begins organizing their time in ways that consistently exclude you, it's not an accident. It's a realignment of priority. And that realignment, no matter how quietly it happens, signals a fundamental shift in how they relate to the relationship itself. This is where psychological dynamics become coldly observable. You stop interpreting through hope and start interpreting through data. You notice not just what they say, but when they say it. Not just what they do, but what they don't do. The absence of spontaneity. The absence of surprise. The absence of the small, unplanned moments that used to define your connection. Everything now feels scheduled, predictable, contained. And containment is the opposite of intimacy. When someone begins containing their presence with you, limiting it to certain times, certain formats, certain levels of engagement, they're not just managing their time. They're managing their emotional exposure. They're creating distance through structure. And that distance, because it's systematic, is much harder to reverse than the distance that comes from chaos. Chaos can resolve. Structure has already made its decision. What you're witnessing now is not someone who's temporarily unavailable. It's someone who's reorganized their internal world in a way that no longer centers you. And that reorganization doesn't happen overnight. It happens gradually, through a series of micro-choices that eventually become patterns. They choose not to text. They choose not to call. They choose not to make plans. And each choice, small as it is a vote for distance. Those votes accumulate. And when they accumulate long enough, they form a clear direction. The relationship patterns you once relied on, spontaneous connection, organic conversation, mutual pursuit, have been replaced with something more controlled, more distant, more measured. And measured connection is not connection. It's tolerance. You're being tolerated, not desired. And that realization, when it hits, is devastating. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's true. This is where people often confront the gap between what they want to believe and what the behavior is showing. They want to believe it's stress. They want to believe it's temporary. They want to believe the person still cares, just differently. But the behavioral evidence points elsewhere. It points toward disengagement, toward emotional detachment, toward someone who's already begun the process of separating, even if they haven't said so. And separation, when it's behavioral rather than verbal, is almost impossible to address. Because how do you confront a pattern? How do you argue with absence? How do you fight for connection with someone who's no longer fighting to stay? You can't. All you can do is witness it, and adjust your own reality accordingly, which means accepting that the relationship you thought you were in may no longer exist. At least, not in the form you believed it did. And that leaves you standing at a threshold, forced to ask, do I keep pretending this is temporary? Or do I start treating it like what it is? You stop expecting things. Not because you decided to, because your nervous system did it for you. After enough unanswered attempts, enough one-sided effort, enough quiet disappointments, your body learns. It learns not to hope for the quick reply, not to anticipate the surprise text, not to look forward to plans that might not happen. This is where reduced expectation becomes a survival mechanism. You train yourself not to want too much, because wanting has started to hurt. And so, without consciously choosing it, you lower the bar. You settle into a version of the relationship that asks less and receives less. And that settling, quiet as it is, becomes the new normal. The emotional behavior between you is no longer driven by desire. It's driven by maintenance. You maintain contact. You maintain civility. You maintain the illusion that things are fine. But underneath, the connection has thinned. What's insidious about this phase is how normalized it feels. You don't wake up one day and think I've accepted less than I deserve. It happens so gradually that by the time you notice, it's already your reality. The psychological dynamics have shifted from mutual engagement to functional coexistence. You talk, but not deeply. You see each other, but not often. You care, but from a distance. And that distance, because it's no longer shocking, becomes comfortable. Not in a good way, in a numb way. You've adjusted to the emotional withdrawal so completely that you no longer register it as withdrawal. You register it as normal. And normal, when it's built on diminished connection, is just another word for slow erosion. The relationship patterns that once brought you joy are now routines you follow without feeling. You go through the motions because the motions are familiar, even when they no longer nourish you. This is where self-deception becomes active. You tell yourself it's fine, that relationships evolve, that not every phase has to be intense. And all of that is technically true. But there's a difference between evolution and decline. Evolution brings new forms of closeness. Decline brings distance, dressed as maturity. And what you're in now isn't maturity, it's resignation. You've resigned yourself to less presence, less warmth, less effort. And in doing so, you've stopped advocating for what you need. You've stopped asking for more because asking feels pointless. The attachment patterns that once made you feel secure now feel fragile. You no longer trust that reaching out will be met with enthusiasm. You no longer trust that expressing a need will be received with care. So you stop reaching. You stop expressing. And in the silence that follows, the relationship continues to drift. What makes this so difficult is that nothing explodes. There's no fight to point to, no clear moment of breakdown. Just a slow, quiet fading. And fading is harder to confront than rupture, because rupture demands attention. Fading just happens. And by the time you realize how far you've drifted, you're not sure if there's a way back, or if the other person even wants to find one. The question that rises now, though you may not voice it, is this: have I been living in a relationship, or just the memory of one? And that question, once it surfaces, doesn't leave. It sits in the background of every interaction, quietly asking you to decide how much longer you're willing to accept a connection that no longer feels like connection at all. Because acceptance, when it's built on lowered expectations, isn't peace. It's just exhaustion pretending to be okay. Reciprocity disappears in ways that are hard to articulate but impossible to ignore. It's not that they never give. It's that they only give when prompted, when asked, when it's convenient. There's no overflow, no spontaneous generosity of attention or affection. Everything feels measured, calculated, conditional. You give, and sometimes they give back. But the giving back feels reactive, not generative. It doesn't come from a place of genuine desire to nurture the connection. It comes from a place of maintaining appearances, of doing just enough to keep you from leaving. And that just enough becomes the ceiling of what you can expect. The emotional behavior you're witnessing now is transactional, not explicitly, but functionally. You've become something to manage, not someone to cherish. And management, no matter how polite, is not love. This is where relationship dynamics reveal their true structure. When reciprocity fades, it exposes what was actually sustaining the relationship. And what you're seeing now is that your effort was holding most of it together. They were coasting, not maliciously, just passively. They allowed you to carry the emotional labor while they conserved their energy for other things. And now that you've started to pull back, not dramatically, just naturally, out of exhaustion, the whole thing is slowing down. Because there's no reciprocal engine, there's no mutual drive. There's just you trying and them responding when it's easy. And a relationship built on that asymmetry cannot sustain itself. It can limp forward. It can maintain a surface-level presence. But it cannot thrive. And somewhere deep inside, you already know this. You've known it for a while. You've just been unwilling to let the knowing become decisive. What you're feeling now isn't anger. It's grief. Grief for the connection you thought you had. Grief for the person you thought they were. Grief for the version of the relationship that existed before the distance set in. And that grief is valid, because loss doesn't only happen through endings. It happens through erosion, through the slow disappearance of presence, warmth, consistency. Through the quiet realization that the person in front of you is no longer the person you fell for. Not because they changed overnight, but because they stopped showing up the way they used to. And when someone stops showing up, reciprocity becomes impossible. You can't reciprocate with absence. You can't build intimacy with withdrawal. You can only watch as the space between you grows, and hope that one day they'll notice. But if they haven't noticed by now, if they haven't felt the absence the way you have, then the imbalance isn't temporary, it's structural. And structural imbalances don't resolve through patience. They resolve through renegotiation, through honest conversation, through someone finally saying this isn't working. But if no one says it, the relationship just continues in its diminished state. Both people present, but neither truly connected. Both going through motions that no longer carry meaning. And the longer that continues, the harder it becomes to remember what it felt like when things were different. When reciprocity was natural. When effort flowed both ways. When the relationship felt like something you built together, not something you're holding up alone. That memory fades. And in its place, a new reality settles in. One where you've learned not to expect much. Not to ask for much. Not to need much. Because needing in a relationship without reciprocity only leads to disappointment. And the question that arrives now, quietly but insistently, is this. If this is what the relationship has become, is it still worth staying in? The signals accumulate. The delays, the distance, the inconsistency, the lack of initiative, the reduced presence. It all adds up. And at a certain point, ambiguity loses its protective function. You can no longer tell yourself it's temporary. You can no longer explain it away. The behavioral patterns are too consistent. The emotional withdrawal too sustained. The gap between what the relationship once was and what it is now too wide to ignore. This is where clarity arrives, not because you wanted it, but because the evidence became undeniable. You're no longer interpreting isolated incidents. You're reading a complete picture. And that picture shows someone who is disengaged. Not loudly, not cruelly. Just steadily, quietly, and without explanation. And once you see that picture clearly, you can't unsee it. This is the moment where relationship psychology stops being theoretical and becomes lived. You understand now that behavior is language, that presence is a choice, that consistency is a form of care. And when all of those things are absent, what remains isn't a relationship, it's a remnant, a shell of what used to be, kept alive by your effort and their passivity. The psychological dynamics here are brutal because they don't offer resolution. They offer only recognition. You recognize that you've been holding on to something that the other person let go of long ago. You recognize that the distance didn't happen to you. It was created. Not with intent to harm, necessarily, but with a slow, quiet withdrawal of investment. And withdrawal, even when it's unconscious, is still a choice. Every time they chose not to text, not to call, not to reach out, they were choosing. And the accumulation of those choices is what brought you here, to this moment, where ambiguity no longer offers comfort, and uncertainty no longer feels like hope. It just feels like truth. What happens now is not about them anymore. It's about you, about what you're willing to accept. About whether you'll continue interpreting their behavior through generosity, or whether you'll start interpreting it through accuracy, because generosity, when it's one-sided, becomes self-abandonment. And you've been generous long enough. You've made excuses long enough. You've adjusted your expectations long enough. And none of it changed the reality. The relationship patterns you hoped would return never did. The emotional behavior you waited to shift remained static. The connection you tried to revive stayed dormant. And at some point, continuing to try stops being perseverance and starts being denial. Denial that the person in front of you is showing you, through their actions, exactly how much space you occupy in their life. And that space is smaller than you wanted to believe. This is not about vilifying them. It's not about anger or blame. It's about seeing clearly. About accepting that emotional distance, when it's this sustained, is not a phase. It's a position. A position they've taken, whether consciously or not. And positions don't shift through waiting. They shift through confrontation, through honesty, through someone finally saying what's been left unsaid for too long. And if that confrontation doesn't happen, if the honesty never arrives, then the relationship will continue in this diminished form until one of you finally walks away. Not because of a dramatic event, but because the accumulation of small absences finally became too heavy to carry. Because the weight of unreciprocated effort finally became unbearable. Because clarity, once it arrives, demands action. And action, in the face of sustained withdrawal, is often just one thing: letting go. And the question that remains, the one that will follow you long after this ends, is not what went wrong. It's why did I stay so long after I knew? The questions that were never answered don't disappear. They settle. They become part of how you see relationships from that point forward. Not as something that failed, but as something that taught you to read behavior before it speaks. To notice distance before it's named. To recognize emotional withdrawal not by what's said, but by what stops happening. And that recognition, uncomfortable as it is what protects you moving forward. Because once you understand how disengagement operates, how it hides in delays, in tone shifts, in the slow erosion of reciprocity, you stop waiting for explanations that will never come. You stop interpreting absence through generosity. You start seeing patterns for what they are, not signs of temporary stress, not evidence of a phase, just the quiet, sustained choice to pull back. And when someone makes that choice repeatedly, without acknowledgement, without correction, the only question left is whether you'll keep participating in a dynamic that no longer includes you the way it once did. Clarity doesn't erase the hurt, but it does return your agency. It gives you permission to stop wondering and start deciding. To stop holding space for someone who's already left it. To stop carrying a connection that only you're trying to preserve. The relationship psychology here is simple. When someone shows you through their behavior that you're no longer a priority, believe them. Not with bitterness, not with blame, just with accuracy. Because accuracy is what allows you to move forward without dragging unanswered questions into every new connection you build. You don't need closure from them. You need clarity within yourself. And clarity comes not from what they finally say, but from what you finally see. If you're still trying to make sense of the silence, if you're still interpreting the distance through hope instead of evidence, there's something you need to watch. The previous video on this channel, the moment silence stopped responding, breaks down the exact behavioral shift that happens when someone has already decided to disengage, but hasn't told you yet. It's not about what they say. It's about what they stop doing. And once you see that breakdown, you'll understand why waiting for answers only keeps you stuck. That video will show you what this one couldn't. The precise moment the dynamic changed, and why you felt it before you could prove it. You need to see it, not because it'll bring them back, but because it'll bring you back to yourself. Go watch it now. If this analysis gave you clarity, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Because understanding relationship patterns isn't a one-time insight. It's an ongoing practice. And the more you understand how emotional behavior operates beneath the surface, the less power ambiguity has over you. Stay sharp. Stay clear. And stop waiting for answers from people who've already shown you everything you need to know.